Slop has got chunks of things in it.
Slop! Slop!
Have I returned after like 4 months to talk about slop again? Yes. I know it's tiring. Look, I got a comment on the last video that I made way back in January, which reads, "Not gonna lie, I thought this video was going to be about the etymology of the word slop and the phrases it became attached to in relation to AI. And I actually thought that would be a pretty interesting topic to discuss. Then I got a job, and now it's April. So, whoops. Don't get me wrong, I have other things that I want to cover on this channel, of course, but when something's in my head, it's gonna fester up there until it either rots or I let it out.
Let it out!
I'm gonna start by saying I despise the word slop. Like, I cannot stand it. Which makes me a big hypocrite because I used it as an all-encompassing adjective in a past video, and I also shoved it in the title and probably the thumbnail of this video because I just love appealing to an algorithm. Lately, this word has been very popular in the realm of video essays and commentary, applied to literally anything that someone wants to call lazy, and it's often associated with generative AI and the lack of skill it takes to use it. Merriam-Webster even cited it as 2025's word of the year. I've also noticed that it's being used in an accusatory way towards things that aren't even AI, which is a whole nother discussion in and of itself. But when it comes down to it, slop is a word that's existed for a long time, transformed into an overused buzzword with economic and political contexts attached to it. For example, liberal and communism, along with capitalism and fascist, are all terms which have become similarly loaded buzzwords, ironically inciting a reaction instead of a conversation. Words that were initially ripe with potential for deeper thought have become antithetical to discourse altogether, and in my opinion, directly opposed to change. But I get it. Conversationalism is good. Things should be approachable because so much of in-depth intellectual theory seems like an endless puzzle of impossible terms, which almost feel like they're trying to make everyone else feel stupid. I'm looking at you, Lacan. Like, imagine showing this to your uncle at Thanksgiving. Even so, let's face it, these buzzwords are commodities.
You're a brave man. Karl Marx, your final question. Who won the cup final in 1949?
The workers control the means of production.
Yeah, I get it. It's a classic Marxist idea. But to explain it a little bit more, real quick, I'm going to turn to Herbert Marcuse's 1964 thesis, One-Dimensional Man, wherein he discusses the incorporation of potentially revolutionary manners of communication into the established market system. If mass communications blend together harmoniously and often unnoticeably art, politics, religion, and philosophy with commercials, they bring these realms of culture to their common denominator, the commodity form. The music of the soul is also the music of salesmanship. Exchange value, not truth value, counts. As the great words of freedom and fulfillment are pronounced by campaigning leaders and politicians on the screens and radios and stages, they turn into meaningless sounds which obtain meaning only in the context of propaganda, business, discipline, and relaxation. Although we think we're fighting against this system by exchanging these words back and forth, we're actually internalizing the rules the system has set up, developing this happy consciousness, as Marcuse calls it, which reflects the belief that the real is rational and that the established system, in spite of everything, delivers the goods. I know you probably didn't come here for a philosophy lesson, but I find these ideas hard to ignore when they eerily reflect the current economic and political climate. I suppose with the dissection of this word, slop, I'm also hoping to poke past the surface and understand its development as a commodity. And before I move on, I'm going to mysteriously drop this quote. Yeah, so somehow I omitted that this quote was from Zizek's 1989 book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, and I used it because I didn't want to deal with a Lacan quote. So, the theoretical intelligence of the form of dreams does not consist in penetrating from the manifest content to its hidden kernel, to the latent dream thoughts. It consists in the answer to the question, why have the latent dream thoughts assumed such a form? Why are they transposed into the form of a dream? Yes. Now that I've implanted that into the back of your mind, let's begin. I began my search by using the Oxford English Dictionary and Merriam-Webster, which both served as great starting points, and then I depended a lot on the Internet Archive to find specific texts which reference the word. So for the modern day meaning, let's take a look at Merriam-Webster's definition. Slop, noun, refers to digital content of low quality that is produced usually in quantity by means of artificial intelligence. Presently, we commonly associate slop with generative AI, but the word slop also appears by itself figuratively when referring to something usually being a form of art or entertainment that is of no value, associated with waste, laziness, and mass production.
And people apparently like you devour this slop like pigs at a dumpster to stay current at fucking cocktail parties or
Okay,
whatever.
you got a lot of opinions.
Apart from its relationship to generative AI, slop probably elicits an image like this, right? Something tasteless, messy, unclearly defined. Food for pigs.
Get rid of that slop.
Alright, now that we've kind of established where we're at right now, let's trace this word's origins. And before I do so, I'm just going to say, if you aren't interested in my obnoxiously thorough coverage of this word's history up until 1500s Britain, aka the very beginnings of modern English, then skip to this timestamp. I think it's interesting, but I realize that not everyone cares to hear about things that are going on in 10th century England. Also, I'm largely tracing this word's origin using reconstructed texts, which feature differing spellings and fuzzy meanings, and sometimes I lose the word for a couple hundred years or so. History is never straightforward, and I'm not a linguist, but I will try my best. Okay, let's go all the way back to the Neolithic or early Bronze Age between 3300 and 1200 BCE, somewhere around the Pontic-Caspian steppe. There's this Proto-Indo-European root, sloop, meaning to slide or slip. Alright, stay with me now. We're jumping to the pre-Roman Iron Age circa 500 BCE, somewhere in southern Scandinavia, and we get the Proto-Germanic slupan, to slip, to slide, or to sneak. And there's a lot of different branches of German we get from there, but for our purposes, let's pay attention to the West Germanic one. Fast forward to somewhere between 401 to 440 CE, and now Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who speak Old Saxon or Old English migrate from northwestern Germany and modern Denmark to Britain or Britannia. Now we have slupan, and it means basically the same thing as our Proto-Germanic root, to slip or to glide with connotations of slipping on something wet or slimy. Around 950 and 1000, I found sliupa, which looks something like this, by the way, but was pronounced with the Y being similar to the German U with an umlaut, and it means slime, paste, pulp, soft semi-liquid mass, or slimy substance, seen in a medical sense when referring to ingredients ground up into a paste. I found sliupan in Saxon Lecht, or Bald's Leech Book, which was a herbal written between 900 to 920, and translated the word to modern English as a viscid substance. Also of note within Saxon Lecht is kuslip, translating to cow slobber, or a sloppy dropping of a cow, associated with fields where cows would graze and subsequently poop. Side note, enter the Duke of Normandy, who was like, I am of the throne of England because I was related to this guy, Edward, who died. Of course, there were other factors to the Norman conquest, but basically in 1066, a bunch of French, Flemish, Norman, and Breton people invaded Britain, and there was dying and bloodshed, and William the Norman guy became the King of England. By this point, up until around 1150, we're in the late stages of Old English, transitioning to Middle English with the introduction of a Norman French, which became the language spoken by the elites and in government. But that upper-class French kind of melds with Old English, and we get Anglo-Norman. Keep in mind, around this time, I'm still seeing sleepin, and I'm also starting to see sloppin spelled with an O in the Oxford English Dictionary, which will come back later, but all you need to know is that they're variations of the same word and are still associated with coosleep, or cow dung. Then I lost track of everything for a while, but I did find slough from slough in Old English, characterized as a hollow place filled with mire or a boggy, swampy place. It's also cited in reference to the cast-off skin of a snake, perhaps important for the developing connotations of slop being related to biological waste. Now, let's position ourselves between 1150 and 1350, where we've entered the early Middle English period, and it's important to remember that there's a lot of different dialects going on, and also the plague is happening, so everything's kind of a mess. I found slough around 1225 in Legend of St. Catherine, and I also see slop spelled like this in 1303, but it's in reference to spilling milk from a magic milk bag. From 1400 to 1500, we're in late Middle English, and vowels are shifting, so I think sleepin starts to sound a little more like slippin, and sloppin sounds the same. I'm not completely sure about the pronunciation here, but I think it was something along those lines. Also, around 1400, we get slop in Mort Arthur, or the death of Arthur, referring to a muddy or wet place. There's also this from just Historiale, or the destruction of Troy, reading, and they slapper and they sluch, slonging to land, thar haile, where slobber, sluch, and slonging are all in relation to mud and slippery slime from the earth. Now we're in the Tudor period, spanning from 1485 to 1603, which means we're also in early modern English territory. Before 1500, I found slip still in a wet, earthy context, but slop is now kind of starting to become its own thing. During this time, slop is a term referring to an outer garment, a loose jacket, tunic, cassock, mantle, gown, or smock frock, often associated with working men in the Navy or farmers. In short, these clothes were meant to get a bit grubby. Slop also begins to gain some significance in relation to a manner of ingesting. To slop is to lap up greedily or messily, to spill carelessly. Also notice how the word in both of these contexts can be linked to some part of its root imagery, the sense of slipping on something of a loose, vaguely messy nature. Some things to keep in mind as we move forward. Who exactly is using the word slop, and who or what is the word slop being applied to? Based on the earlier stages of this word's history, I'm going to make an educated guess and say that it was linked to how people in lower class positions described their daily working lives. The word was associated with agriculture, livestock, herbal medicine, and overall the dirtier, more unpleasant parts of the natural environment peasants most likely interacted and collaborated with regularly. Even in literature, the word slop is associated with toil and exhaustion. In the Tudor period, as I've just mentioned, slop is affiliated with clothes worn by working class men, as well as table etiquette deemed as improper. But now it seems to be acting more like a label to distinguish upper class refinement both in clothing and manners from that of laborers. Ironically, slop is being used to define the very people who understand the word's meaning at its truest form. The Stuart era occurs between 1603 and 1714, and while I'm going to continue to depend on time periods in England as a guideline for now, I didn't forget about those colonial settlements in North America, which were being established around this time as well. Anyway, there are two major developments in regards to slop. First, the word has grown from a way of eating to what is being eaten, used to describe liquid or semi-liquid food of a weak, unappetizing kind, applied contemptuously to spoon food or food fed to people who were ill or convalescent. It also becomes a term for food fed to pigs, now usually plural. In the late 1600s, the compound slip-slop appears, derived from slip-slap in association with curds and whey. Harkening back to its meanings in the 11th century, it's related to alchemy, defined as compounded liquid for medicine. Once again, slip and slop can both be traced back to the root sleep. Slip-slop shows up a lot in the Georgian era between 1714 and 1837, now referring to loose or not entirely thoughtful writing or speech, as well as the misuse of words. It also could invoke meanings of being overly romantic, soft, or juvenile, perhaps associated with its previous usage in connection with caring for the sick or the weak. In the 1800s, slip-slop is also applied to other forms of art and craftsmanship, as well as careers or even people in general, as an insult to their intelligence. And it's more often than not seen in magazines and newspapers produced by educated middle to upper class writers to describe or critique other upper class individuals or professions for an audience of upper class intellectuals. While the general public was growing increasingly literate, there still existed this bubble of educational elitism in polite society. We continue to see slop associated with bland food, but it's also being used to define a place where leftover cold tea or leaves would be disposed of, called a slop basin. The connotation of slop being equivalent to waste is certainly not new, but it's interesting to think of this tea garbage existing within a social space, initially confined to upper-class individuals until the late 1800s. In aristocratic domains, tea leaves become meaningless garbage after their pure essence is drawn out or watered down. Individualized tastes of Darjeeling or Earl Grey are reduced to the same mass of slop to be thrown in the basin. For the working class, what would have been considered slop by upper classes is reused a couple times over throughout the day until the flavor is completely gone. Related to the connotation of waste, we start to see slop being used to describe excrement thrown out into the street, and I'll also mention that slop is still appearing in reference to a mud hole or a messy environment. In the Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901, slip-slop is starting to lose its slip and shows up as just slop, usually put in front of something to signify that it's poorly or lazily made. While it continues to be used in the realm of literature reviews, it's also largely seen in clothes construction, and more specifically sweatshops. For example, slop work and slop goods in the slop trade. As the Industrial Revolution gave way to industrial capitalism, workers were increasingly exploited. In these sweatshops, underpaid and overworked laborers, largely women, children, and immigrants, would produce ready-made clothing for other working-class individuals. In America, these clothes were largely constructed for slaves. Real quick, I think it's worth mentioning, the first 3 volumes of London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew served as one of the primary sources for a first-hand understanding of how the slop trade exploited the poor, and also affected artisans and trade societies trying to maintain and improve their craft. On the one hand, Mayhew tries to destigmatize these trade societies, earlier forms of what would become trade unions, which at that time were mostly concerned with maintaining and improving their craft as well as advocating for fair wages, which was good. But Mayhew conveniently doesn't mention that these guys, keyword guys, would urge master tailors to limit their apprentices so as to prevent less proficient individuals from diminishing their craft, a craft which they limited to working men. This forced many women and girls into positions affiliated with slop shops, where they had no other choice but to accept the unfair wage that these trade societies were fighting against. Mayhew even later acknowledges, but the slop workers, by toiling from 13 to 16 hours a day, will make 9 such size mantles in a week. In a season of 12 weeks, 1,000 workers for the slop houses and warehouses would at this rate make 108,000 mantles, or 36,000 more than workers for the fair trade. Or to put it in another light, these slop women, by being compelled, in order to live, to work such over-hours as inflict lasting injury on the health. Once again, slop is wielded as a derogatory term by upper-class tailors to describe clothes as well as the individuals who made those clothes, which were not up to their standards. Standards which existed within this familiar bubble of elitism previously discussed in regards to publications and magazines. Although there is sympathy expressed for these workers, there's no move to really understand. It's still done in a way that objectifies them as a mass of laboring victims instead of individual people. And while the term slop is thrown around in polite society, the actual material conditions of the word are still confined to the lower class sweatshops. Also of note, slop in relation to poop expanded, as there exist not just slop basins for tea, but slop buckets or barrels for throwing wastewater from baths, as well as bodily refuse into the street. Now entering the 20th century, slop is widely cited in realms of entertainment, mainly in writing, theater, and film. Slop was also used in reference to movement, to describe traipsing or walking around without any intention, as well as a popular dance move in the 1960s. Of course, slop is still applied to food for pigs and serves as a vague definition for something generally messy and unappealing. As a review, slop is messy and vague. It's something which was once composed of individual ingredients, elements, or ideas that were combined, diluted, or destroyed in some way to create the said undefinable semi-liquid mass of waste. In order for slop to be created, there has to be some kind of action, some kind of labor, which is often connected to the exploitation of the masses in exchange for the upper class's monetary gain. High-class intellectuals or craftspeople also ascribe slop to the lower class, with the sense that the masses are too uneducated to realize what good quality or craftsmanship is, or that they don't care about it altogether. This dismisses the material conditions in labor which each of these individuals must endure to simply live. From the 1980s to present day, the advent of the internet meant that anyone who had access to a computer could critique or give their opinions about culture. From the 1990s to 2020, slop is cited in official internet articles, casual blogs, and forums, most often still referring to forms of entertainment, specifically writing and publishing, as well as movies and TV, which were once fulfilling until they weren't, or were never good in comparison to other good quality pieces of media. I think sometime around 2022, the term AI slop began gaining traction alongside the swelling heaps of incomprehensible AI images surfacing on social media. Although AI-generated images or writing may seem distinct from the human labor we've been discussing, I think the whole process of making something with AI serves as a perfect example of alienated labor, one of Marx's quintessential concepts wherein the worker becomes estranged from their own labor and the objects they produce. And this is fundamentally linked to the production of commodities. Let's think back to some examples we've covered in our exploration of the word slop. Before slop was produced, it existed as individual medicinal ingredients, different fragments of food, particular pieces of fabric, or maybe there was an idea, a character for a book, a sequence of shots in a film. In AI's case, there's a question or a prompt which someone thinks up. Now let's also consider who's handling those ingredients. Is it a chef dedicated to what they're cooking, even down to its presentation on the plate? Or is it a corporation, depending on their minimum wage employees, to cook and present highly processed food to other people who can't afford to exactly care what they're putting in their bodies? Is it a tailor or a fashion designer carefully sewing a garment, fitting it to a model or celebrity's body? Or is it a company exploiting young women and children who make garments for those who want to wear something that makes them feel like those celebrities or models without paying the price? Is it an auteur, an indie director hoping to capture their innermost feelings on film? Or is it another Hollywood sequel? There's an individual conveying something tied to their innermost human spirit, something which is at an ideal status and should be excluded from economic value, but is often monopolized by elites because of its exchange value. And then there is a corporation who wishes to profit from a commodified human soul under the guise of offering a likeness of ideal status to the masses. That's kind of what it comes down to, which sounds like a bummer. But AI complicates this by seemingly putting control like that of a corporation in the hands of anyone with access to a computer. By putting a prompt into AI and generating something, have you regained control over your own labor? Are you handling those ingredients? Are you an artist? Well, maybe you've been tricked into believing it. Ultimately, this thing that a corporation has created and is getting you to engage with is still alienating you from the labor required to make art, trying to trick you into believing that what you're creating is your own, even if it's built off of existing writing or art which others have worked hard to make. Sure, no one has an original thought, and all art, if you think about it, is built off of existing ideas, but you can't imitate a Picasso painting without studying one first, without putting a brush to canvas, without working towards it. Thus, through the front of AI, a corporation is still depending on someone else's stolen labor to make a profit for themselves, while all you get is an ostensibly meaningless image or piece of text. They get the money, while you get the garbage they've tricked you into believing is something that improves your value or worth as a writer, as an artist, or as a human being. As Marcuse puts it, that ideal creation is brought down from the sublimated realm of the soul or the spirit or the inner man, translated into operational terms and problems. This is where it becomes a commodity, with a flashy shell and a meaningless inside. With that, let's circle back to the discussion of the word slop as a commodity, and also bring back that mysterious Zizek quote. The theoretical intelligence of the form of dreams does not consist in penetrating from the manifest content to its hidden kernel, to the latent dream thoughts. It consists in the answer to the question, why have the latent dream thoughts assumed such a form? Why are they transposed into the form of a dream? Zizek is interested in why a dream takes the form that it does, not what it means. If I'm stressed or overwhelmed about something in my life, why does that take the form of me falling down an elevator shaft when I'm asleep? If we liken the dream world to our own perceived reality within society, with dream forms being equal to that of commodities, we can ask the same question. Why work assumed the form of the value of a commodity? Why it can affirm its social character only in the commodity form of its product? Why is the labor exploited to make slop only valuably expressed in its final product, its commodity form? Why do we have the desire to use the word slop when trying to discuss the deeper issues related to it? As I've reiterated continuously, when something becomes a commodity to be exchanged, its special qualities, its individual aspects are forgotten by the people doing the exchanging. In other words, the commodity makes abstraction of its own particular attributes possible. And if the participants of the exchange were to take note of the dimension of real abstraction, the effective act of exchange itself would no longer be possible. Within that act of exchange, there is this preconceived notion that something deeper exists behind the word. So why would I do the dirty work of understanding distinct ideological meanings when they're so aptly summed up in this term? Accordingly, my thoughts are articulated in advance by someone or something else, and I can sit back and enjoy using this word to feel like I'm offering my individual thoughts to discourse while being comforted and bolstered by a fantasy of meaning. The desire, the fantasy is the key here. We desire to use the word because it's comforting to not be confronted by the work. It's easy and ironically kind of lazy to use the word slop. Now, I realize that this is a privileged thing to say, and I get that it's tiring to always be thinking of society as this constructed concept. So I've decided that I'm gonna play the game. I'll still continue to enjoy this word, but I'll also do it critically instead of passively. I'll condemn slop while also considering why people are making it. Where is it actually coming from? And what or who is it a front for?